She entered the lecture hall with a quiet grace, a simple woman clad in a gray cardigan. When Professor Harrington, the renowned academic, dared her to solve an impossible equation, a wave of smug glances passed through the room. The students knew what was coming. They were about to witness not just a display of mathematical brilliance, but the kind of comeuppance that would reverberate through the halls of Texas State University for years to come. The lecture hall was thick with anticipation as Professor Richard Harrington, a man whose reputation loomed over the university, made his way to the podium. Distinguished mathematician, head of the department, and known for his disdain toward anyone he deemed less than intellectually worthy, he was a figure who commanded respect, even fear. Sarah Mitchell settled into the back row, smoothing the gray cardigan over her white blouse. At 37, she was far older than the graduate students surrounding her, but she wasn't there to blend in. She was there to learn. Today's symposium will focus on Riemann's hypothesis and its implications for quantum computing, Harrington announced, his voice cutting through the air, silencing the room instantly. His silver beard and sharply tailored blue suit exuded authority, but it was the subtle sneer in his eyes as they briefly landed on Sarah that caught her attention. That look. It was the same one she'd received years ago when she'd applied for a position in the university's maintenance staff. A quick glance, followed by dismissal. The symposium began with the usual academic presentations, each doctoral candidate eager to make their mark. Sarah, however, took to her notes with precision, her eyes alight with enthusiasm at the complex theories unfolding before her. But when the floor opened for questions, she kept her hand down. She knew her place in this world, and it wasn't at the front of the room. During the break, Sarah overheard two students snickering in hushed tones. "Who's the cleaning lady taking notes?" One whispered, "Probably just here for continuing education credits." The other responded with a dismissive laugh. Harrington hates when non-math types sit in on these talks. A tightness gripped Sarah's chest, but she held her composure. They didn't know. How could they? That mathematics had been her lifelong companion, that she had taught herself calculus late at night between cleaning jobs and after tucking her daughter into bed. The equations danced in her mind, an intricate ballet of numbers and symbols, far more vivid than anything she could have dreamed. As the symposium resumed, Professor Harrington began discussing his approach to a challenging, unsolved problem. His words flowed with the confidence of someone who believed his solution was unassailable. But Sarah, quietly listening, recognized an issue in his reasoning. She had studied this very problem for countless nights. "Any questions?" Harrington asked, his tone suggesting he didn't expect a single meaningful one. The room remained still, and then, almost against her will, Sarah's hand rose. A wave of eyes turned to her. For a moment, she wished she could take it back. Professor Harrington's eyebrows arched in mock surprise. "Yes, ma'am?" His voice was dripping with condescension. "I was wondering about the variable transformation in step 4, Sarah said, her voice softer than she intended. "Wouldn't that introduce inconsistencies when applied to the boundary conditions?" A long silence followed. Students exchanged furtive glances. Harrington's face darkened. "Your name?" he demanded. "Sarah Mitchell." "And your department?" Sarah hesitated. "I work in facilities management." A ripple of disbelief ran through the room. Harrington's smile widened, now tinged with amusement. "Facilities management," he repeated, savoring the words. "And you believe you've found an error in my work?" Sarah's face burned. "Not an error exactly, but a potential complication that, perhaps," Harrington cut in, "you should focus on more accessible pursuits, rather than questioning established mathematical principles." Several students laughed. Sarah felt herself shrink, wishing she had kept her hand down, wishing she had stayed invisible. But what neither she nor anyone else could foresee was that this moment of public humiliation would become the catalyst for something extraordinary. Harrington, sensing an easy target, pushed further. "Since our guest from facilities management is so confident in mathematical theory," he said, straightening his tie slowly, "perhaps she'd like to demonstrate her expertise." He gestured toward the chalkboard. "Come forward, Ms. Mitchell." For a heartbeat, Sarah stood frozen. Every part of her screamed to retreat, to disappear into the anonymity of the back row. But something deeper within her, something that could no longer bear being underestimated, propelled her forward. The walk to the front of the room felt like an eternity. The wooden floor seemed to echo her every step, the whispers of the students trailing behind her like a dark cloud. Taking the chalk from Harrington's outstretched hand, she fought the urge to meet his eyes. "Let's make this accessible," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. He turned to the board and wrote a complex differential equation, one Sarah recognized immediately. It was a tough problem from advanced multivariate calculus, but by no means unsolvable for someone with the right mindset. The true challenge, however, was the public spectacle he was constructing. "Take your time," Harrington said, his voice laden with insincerity. "We're all eager to learn from diverse perspectives." Laughter rippled through the audience. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she stared at the equation. Behind her, a student whispered, "This is painful to watch." Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a visiting professor from MIT, watched from the front row, her frown betraying disapproval. She remained silent, but her eyes were fixed on Sarah. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. The numbers and symbols on the board began to arrange themselves in her mind, as they always did. She had never had formal training beyond community college, but mathematics had been her constant companion, the one thing that made sense when everything else in life was chaos. With a deep breath, she raised the chalk and began to write. Harrington opened his mouth, but his words faltered as he watched Sarah work. Her movements fluid and sure. The room fell into an uncanny stillness as she solved the problem with a grace that seemed to defy the complexity of the equation. She wasn't in a room full of skeptical onlookers. She was in her element. When she finished, Sarah stepped back. The chalkboard was filled with a solution that not only solved the problem but did so with a surprising elegance. Harrington's smug expression faltered. "That's correct," he muttered, though his words were laced with reluctance. Anyone with basic calculus training could have done that. Dr. Chen's eyes widened, her gaze flicking to her colleague in astonishment. Unwilling to admit defeat, Harrington quickly erased the board. "Let's try something more challenging," he said, his voice sharper. "Something from my current research." He wrote a new equation, one Sarah didn't recognize immediately. It was a problem from cutting-edge theoretical mathematics, a puzzle with implications for quantum encryption. "This problem," Harrington explained, "has significant implications for quantum computing encryption." His eyes never left Sarah's face. "If you'd prefer to return to your seat, I'd certainly understand." The challenge hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown before her. The room waited in tense silence for Sarah to back down. Instead, she took a step forward and picked up the chalk. She studied the equation. It was complex, abstract, and filled with unfamiliar notation. Her confidence wavered for a moment. This wasn't just any problem. This was next-level mathematics, the kind of thing she had only read about in articles while sitting hunched over a library computer during lunch breaks. The silence thickened, and the tension in the room was almost palpable. Some students leaned forward, eager for Sarah's failure. Others looked on with pity. "As I suspected," Harrington said, his voice full of anticipation as he reached for the chalk. "Perhaps we should continue with the symposium." But Sarah didn't let go of the chalk. "Wait," she said softly, pulling it away from him. Something had clicked. A pattern had revealed itself within the seemingly chaotic symbols. She began to write, slowly at first and then with growing confidence. As she worked through the problem, the tension in the room shifted. Even Harrington's smug demeanor faltered. Chun leaned forward. Her interest peaked as Sarah's unconventional approach took shape. It wasn't just that Sarah was solving the equation, it was the way she was solving it. Her method was unconventional, but it was working. Halfway through, Sarah paused, her brow furrowing. There was something in the equation that didn't quite fit. Harrington's smile returned, a touch of superiority creeping back into his expression. "A valiant attempt," he said, reaching for the chalk. But Sarah didn't let go of it. Instead, she focused harder, her mind racing. The room around her faded as she poured every ounce of attention into the equation. And then, like a lock clicking open, she saw the solution, the elegant transformation that would simplify the entire equation. She began writing again, more decisively now. The scratching of the chalk was the only sound that filled the hall as she applied her transformation. And as she did, audible gasps rippled through the front row. Chun leaned in, whispering something to her colleague, who nodded in agreement. Harrington's complexion had drained of all color. No longer was he watching Sarah's solution with derision, now it was alarm, his gaze flickering between confusion and disbelief. What she was doing shouldn't have been possible, certainly not for someone without formal training. "That's not the standard approach," he said sharply, his voice laced with a mix of irritation and uncertainty. Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. She was too immersed in the flow of the mathematics, too deep in the rhythm of numbers and patterns that had always felt more like home than anything else. She wasn't simply solving Harrington's problem. She was improving it, finding efficiencies he had overlooked. As the solution neared completion, the tension in the room had shifted dramatically. The students who had laughed at Sarah earlier were now silent, their faces etched with a mixture of confusion and reluctant respect. The professors in the front row had begun to whisper urgently among themselves, exchanging looks of disbelief. Harrington himself seemed torn between maintaining his authority and an undeniable fascination with the unfolding mathematical brilliance. Sarah was nearly finished when Harrington suddenly moved toward the board. He leaned in close, his finger tracing one particular transformation she had used. "This simplification," he said, his voice now tight with a barely contained emotion. "Where did you learn it?" For the first time, Sarah met his gaze directly. "I didn't learn it," she replied simply. "I just saw it." The moment hung between them, the tension palpable. The prestigious professor and the maintenance worker, two worlds colliding in front of an equation neither had expected. Before Harrington could respond, Dr. Chan stood, her voice cutting through the quiet. "That's the Lu Takahashi method," she said, her words carrying across the hall like a shockwave. "It was only published in the International Journal of Quantum Mathematics last month." She turned to Sarah, her eyes narrowing with disbelief. "How could you possibly know about it?" The room was still, every pair of eyes locked on. Sarah, waiting for an answer. Sarah stared at the chalk in her hand, her mind racing. The weight of the moment settled on her. This was the crossroads she'd spent years avoiding. For so long, she had hidden her abilities, convinced that no one would believe a woman working in maintenance, raising a daughter alone, could comprehend advanced mathematics. She had kept her love for numbers in the shadows, learning quietly, keeping her passion to herself. But now, with all eyes on her, the choice was clear. Retreat into the safety of anonymity, or stand in her truth. Retreat or rise, she thought to herself. "I didn't know it was called the Lu Takahashi method," Sarah said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I've never had formal training beyond community college." "Impossible," Harrington scoffed, though the arrogance in his voice had been replaced by an edge of doubt. "These concepts require years of specialized education." Dr. Chan, her brow furrowed, stepped closer to the board, studying Sarah's work more intently. "Yet here it is, perfectly executed," she said, turning to Sarah. "How?" The weight of their scrutiny pressed down on Sarah, but she didn't look away. In that moment, she thought of her daughter, Lily, who worked 2 jobs to save for college. Her daughter who had seen her mother shrink and hide, avoiding the very recognition Sarah was now faced with. "Mathematics has always made sense to me," Sarah said, her voice quieter yet firm. "When I look at equations, I see patterns, connections. Solutions reveal themselves when I look long enough." A voice from the third row broke the silence. "But you work in maintenance. Why aren't you?" "Because life happens," Sarah cut him off, her tone hardening. I had my daughter young. Her father left. I needed stable work with health insurance. She gestured toward the board, the partially completed solution still hanging there. This doesn't pay the bills or provide health care for a child. The room was still, the air thick with the unspoken truth of Sarah's life. The audience could no longer ignore the reality of her circumstances. But why attend this symposium? Harrington asked, his voice no longer mocking, but genuinely puzzled. Sarah met his gaze, steady and unwavering. Because I love mathematics. Because learning doesn't stop when life gets complicated. The chalk felt heavier in her hand as she turned back to the board. The equation, half-solved, stood before her, a metaphor for the decision she now had to make. She could stop, return to her seat, retreat into the familiar confines of her life, or she could finish what she had started, fully reveal the mind she had kept hidden for so long. Sarah lifted the chalk again. Her hand was no longer trembling. I'm going to finish this, she said, almost to herself, but loud enough for the room to hear. With that quiet declaration, Sarah Mitchell stepped fully into her power. The simple woman from facilities management, the unassuming mother, was ready to show these elite minds just how far her understanding of mathematics reached. As Sarah returned her focus to the equation, the room held its breath. The chalk poised in her hand. The silence was so profound that the sound of chalk scraping against the blackboard seemed to echo through the hall, reverberating in every corner. Her mind cleared, and for a moment, there was no audience, no professor, no students, no judgment. Only the pure, untouchable realm of mathematics. She worked with fluid grace, her hand moving confidently across the board, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. When she reached a particularly challenging section, she paused. Her eyes narrowed, a slight tilt of her head as she considered an unexpected approach. Without hesitation, she made a substitution that simplified the entire equation. Chen's sharp intake of breath filled the silence. She's using dimensional analysis to collapse the quantum variance, she whispered to a colleague. I've never seen anyone approach it that way. Harrington stood rigid, his face betraying nothing. He watched Sarah's solution unfold, his earlier arrogance replaced by something harder to define. It wasn't just that Sarah's work was correct. It was innovative, elegant. It was the kind of mathematical thinking that surpassed mere calculation. When Sarah finished, placing the final value in a neat box and stepping back, the room remained silent. The solution on the board was more than just an answer, it was a revelation. Not only had she solved Harrington's challenge, but she had improved upon it, finding efficiencies and insights that had never been published. Chun was the first to break the silence. That's remarkable, she said, approaching the board. You've collapsed 3 steps into one with this transformation. She turned to the room, her voice filled with awe. This isn't just correct, she added, her tone laced with reverence. It's brilliant. A murmur spread through the audience. The students who had once sneered now regarded Sarah with wide-eyed respect. Several professors had already pulled out their phones, discreetly snapping photos of her work. Harrington cleared his throat, his voice thick with reluctant admission. While unconventional, he said, his words slow and almost painful, I suppose the approach has merit. Merit? Dr. Chan shot him a look, her eyebrows arched in disbelief. Richard, this solution could advance our understanding of quantum encryption mathematics. This is publishable work. Sarah stood quietly, chalk dust settling on her fingers, feeling strangely detached from the rising commotion around her. This hadn't been about proving anyone wrong. She had simply responded to the challenge before her, doing her best. Ms. Mitchell, Dr. Chun said, her voice cutting through the murmur, as she turned to face Sarah directly. Have you documented any of your other mathematical insights? Sarah hesitated, her thoughts pulling her back to the quiet hours of the night when she worked alone, when the world outside had fallen asleep and all that mattered were the numbers in front of her. I have notebooks, she said, almost defensively. Just things I work on at night when I can't sleep. Notebooks? Harrington repeated. His curiosity piqued at last. The earlier prideful air replaced with genuine professional interest. What kind of mathematics do you explore? Different things, Sarah replied, suddenly feeling self-conscious again. Number theory mostly. Some work on prime factorization algorithms. Dr. Chun and Harrington exchanged startled glances. Prime factorization was at the heart of cryptography, one of the most advanced areas in applied mathematics. I'd like to see these notebooks, Dr. Chun said, her tone now firm and commanding. A student in the front row stood, breaking the tension. That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen, he said, his voice enthusiastic, and then began to applaud. Slowly, others joined in, their claps swelling until the room was filled with the sound of applause. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with something different now. Not shame, but embarrassment. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't wanted it. The applause was not what she had sought. As the applause continued, she caught the eye of a young woman in the back row, a student who had been watching intently throughout the demonstration. The young woman gave a small nod, one filled with profound respect, as if witnessing something life-changing. In that instant, Sarah understood that this wasn't just about mathematics. It had never been. She had become visible, truly visible, for the first time in her life. Her mind, her knowledge, her potential had stepped out of the shadows and into the light. The applause eventually faded, but something had shifted permanently in that room. Not just for Sarah, but for everyone who had watched her transformation, from invisible to extraordinary. Though the symposium had officially ended an hour ago, the lecture hall remained crowded. Sarah found herself surrounded by professors and graduate students, all eager to ask about her mathematical insights. Chun hadn't left her side, almost protectively. Your intuitive grasp of multidimensional analysis is extraordinary, a quantum computing professor told her. Have you ever considered formal study? Sarah gave a sad, knowing smile. Consider it? Yes. Afford it? No. Across the room, Professor Harrington was deep in conversation with the department dean. His gestures were animated, occasionally pointing in Sarah's direction. His earlier condescension had morphed into something more complicated, a reluctant professional respect, laced with defensiveness. Chun gently touched Sarah's arm. We should talk about your future, she said quietly. MIT has fellowship programs designed for exceptional cases like yours. Sarah blinked, startled. MIT? Me? Talent like yours doesn't come along often, Dr. Chun replied. It would be mathematical malpractice to let it go unnurtured. Just then, the crowd parted, and Professor Harrington approached. His silver beard seemed to twitch slightly with unspoken emotion. Mitchell, he said, his voice formal but tinged with something different now. The department would like to review your notebooks, if you're willing. There might be opportunities to discuss. His words were careful, measured. It wasn't quite an apology, but to someone like Harrington, it was the closest thing to one. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. I'll bring them tomorrow. I'll be reviewing them personally, Dr. Chun interjected smoothly, her eyes narrowing at Harrington in a way that made his mouth tighten. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Sarah gathered her things. Her phone buzzed, showing 5 missed calls from the babysitter. Real life was calling, an unwelcome reminder of the practicalities that had always held her back. Walking toward the exit, she was stopped by a young female student. Miss Mitchell? The student said hesitantly, her voice filled with awe. I'm studying engineering, and I just wanted to say thank you. For what? Sarah asked, momentarily confused. For showing that where you start doesn't determine what you know. The student's eyes glistened with emotion, as though Sarah had unlocked something inside of her. I'm a first-generation college student from a rural town. People make assumptions about me, too. Sarah felt a warmth unfold in her chest. She hadn't anticipated how much her moment might impact others. Outside the building, the evening air felt different somehow, charged with possibility. Sarah took a deep breath, thinking of the notebooks waiting for her at home, filled with years of solitary mathematical exploration. Tomorrow, those private thoughts would be scrutinized by some of the brightest minds in the field. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. And for the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a different future. One where her mind, not her uniform, defined her. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in front of a different classroom. This one was smaller, with eager undergraduate faces watching as she explained a complex theorem. The sleeves of her gray cardigan were pushed up as she wrote across the whiteboard. No longer hesitant or apologetic about claiming space, she moved with the confidence of someone who had come into her own. After the symposium, Dr. Chan had arranged an emergency fellowship, recognizing that Sarah's talent couldn't be left to wait for the traditional academic process. 2 of her theoretical approaches had already been published with her as the primary author. Professor Harrington, despite the time it had taken, had come around. His earlier condescension had been replaced by grudging acknowledgement of her insights, especially after her work on quantum encryption had attracted attention from research institutions across the country. The most significant change, however, had been internal. Sarah no longer hid her intelligence or passion. She spoke with authority about her work, knowing that her value wasn't rooted in credentials but in the power of her mind. Her daughter, Lily, had transferred to the university on a full scholarship, inspired by her mother's example to pursue her own dreams without apology. As Sarah finished explaining the theorem, a student raised her hand. A young woman, her eyes filled with both uncertainty and determination. Sarah called on her immediately, remembering what it felt like to be overlooked. "Never be afraid to raise your hand," Sarah told her students, her voice firm but warm. "The question you're afraid to ask might change everything, not just for you but for everyone in the room." If Sarah's journey from overlooked to extraordinary resonated with you, remember, genius exists in the most unexpected places, often hidden not by a lack of ability, but by circumstances. Who might you be underestimating in your own life? Share your stories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of recognition and transformation, please subscribe for more glimpses of extraordinary moments that change lives. Sometimes the greatest minds aren't found in lecture halls, but in the spaces we least expect. Like, share, and join our community of storytellers, celebrating unsung heroes everywhere.